There is a particular quality to the darkness just before a change that no one has yet named. It is not the darkness of ignorance. It is the darkness of a world that does not yet know what it is about to lose. The year is 1900. In the cities of Europe and America, gas lamps cast their amber pools across cobblestone streets, still worn smooth by the hooves of horses. Coal smoke hangs above the rooftops of Manchester and Pittsburgh in permanent grey curtains, staining the linen of anyone who dares hang, washing on a line. The average person living in those streets has never seen an electric light up close, has never imagined a world that does not smell of burning. They rise before dawn, work until the light fails, and sleep beneath the same stars their grandparents knew. The world hums along on a diet of fire and muscle, and the steady, patient burning of everything that can be burned. And yet, beneath that ordinary surface, and something is already moving. In a handful of laboratories scattered across the industrialized world, men with chalk-stained fingers and sleepless eyes are looking at forces that most of their contemporaries do not believe exist. They are not building better steam engines or refining the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. They are doing something stranger and more dangerous than that, and they are listening to the physics of the world itself, and what they are hearing is suggesting that the entire architecture of the energy economy, the coal and the steam and the burning and the billing, is not a necessity. It is a choice. Walk through those streets in 1900, and you would see nothing unusual. A carriage rattles past. A newspaper boy shouts a headline about a war somewhere distant. A factory whistle cleaves the morning. Everything seems ordained, inevitable, one the only possible world. But step into the right laboratory on the right evening, and you would find a man who is about to demonstrate that the orderly, smoky, expensive world you just walk through is entirely optional. There were, at the turn of the 20th century, 3 or 4 people alive on Earth who were sitting on discoveries so fundamental, so structurally threatening to the economic order of their time, that had any one of them been allowed to complete their work, in the century that followed would have been unrecognizable, not better in the vague utopian sense that optimists invoke, better in a precise physical sense, warmer in winter, cooler in summer, fed rather than hungry, lit rather than dark, and free in a way that the word barely means anymore. From the slow financial bleeding of paying for access to a force that fills the air, the earth, and the space between the atoms of every object in existence. Consider for a moment what that means. On the energy problem, the source of more human suffering, more political violence, more environmental destruction than perhaps any other single factor in the modern world, was already solved before the 20th century began. Not in theory, not on paper, in wire and copper and crackling, arcing, beautiful electricity. Or at least that is what the record suggests. And the record, as we will examine together across this documentary, is more detailed, more credible, and more unsettling than almost anyone has told you. In the winter of 1899, in a wooden laboratory perched at altitude outside Colorado Springs, a man sat alone by candlelight and wrote in a leather journal with the careful, considered hand of someone who believes they are recording something for the future. Outside, the Rocky Mountain sky was electric, literally. He had made it so. His name has not yet appeared in this story. It will. And when it does, and nothing that follows will seem like coincidence. Close your eyes for a moment, not literally, because you are listening, but in the way that you do when you want to feel rather than think. And consider the air around you right now. Not the oxygen, not the nitrogen, not the trace gases. Consider the electromagnetic field that fills every cubic centimeter of the space you occupy. It is not empty, it is not passive, it is alive with energy, pulsing with frequencies that range from the rumble of the Earth's own resonance to the shimmer of the cosmic microwave background. A whisper from the birth of the universe itself. You are, at this moment, immersed in an ocean of energy so vast that it makes every power station ever built look like a candle beside a sun. You have always been immersed in it. Every human being who has ever lived has spent their entire life inside this invisible ocean. And for most of human history, we paid nothing to access it, because we did not yet know it was there. The question that a handful of remarkable engineers began asking at the end of the 19th century was deceptively simple. If this energy is everywhere, if it flows through the earth and resonates in the ionosphere and crackles in every thunderstorm that rolls across every continent, why do we not have a mechanism for collecting it, not creating it? The laws of physics are perfectly clear that energy cannot be created from nothing, but collecting it, harvesting it, the way a sail harvests the wind, the way a water wheel harvests a river. The wind did not originate in the sail. The river did not originate in the wheel. They were already there, already moving, already carrying energy that needed only the right structure to become useful. What would it look like, these engineers were asking, to build a sail for the electromagnetic ocean? The concept has a precise technical name: ambient electromagnetic energy extraction. And it is grounded in real physics, the principles of resonance and electromagnetic induction, the same principles that make your radio work, the same principles that allow a transformer to move electricity from one wire to another without physical contact. There is nothing mysterious or impossible about the underlying physics. The question has always been one of engineering. Can you build a structure that resonates with the ambient field efficiently enough to produce usable power? Nikola Tesla believed he could. More than believed, he was certain, because he had already done it. In the summer of 1899, working in that high-altitude laboratory in Colorado Springs, Tesla conducted a series of experiments that he recorded in exhaustive detail. He was interested in a specific property of the Earth, its capacity to conduct electrical energy when vibrated at the right frequency. Not the soil itself, but the resonant electromagnetic cavity formed by the Earth's surface below and the ionosphere above, a shell of charged particles that wraps the planet like a second skin, continuously energized by the solar wind and by the approximately 100 lightning strikes that hit the Earth's surface every single second. Tesla transmitted electrical power through this cavity, not through wires, through the earth. He lit 200 bulbs from 25 miles away with no physical connection between the power source and the lights. His own notebooks describe the experiment in the careful, specific language of an engineer who knows that what he is writing will someday need to be replicated. Multiple eyewitnesses confirm the result, and Tesla himself, in a letter written the following year, he described what he had demonstrated as a working prototype for a system that could, if scaled, deliver electrical power to any point on the Earth's surface, to any device, to any human being, without a wire, without a meter, without a bill. That was 1899. The air you are breathing right now is the same air Tesla breathed that night in Colorado. The earth beneath you is the same earth that vibrated beneath his feet. The electromagnetic ocean that surrounds you is, in every physical sense, identical to the one he was navigating more than 100 years ago. So who discovered it first, and what happened to them? There is a particular kind of historical horror that has nothing to do with violence or catastrophe. It is the horror of the erased, the feeling that comes when you realize that something enormous once existed, and that the reason you do not know about it is not because it was lost, but because it was removed. What follows is not a full account. Full accounts take years, and this is not years. This is a beginning, an introduction to 5 names that this documentary will return to again and again, each time with greater depth and greater clarity. For now, think of these 5 names as files being laid on a table. Each one is a case. Each one is a mystery. And taken together, they form a pattern so consistent that explaining it as coincidence requires considerably more faith than the alternative. Nikola Tesla, you know the name, probably from a car brand, possibly from a physics class, almost certainly from some passing reference to a forgotten genius. But you do not yet know what Tesla actually discovered in Colorado Springs in the summer of 1899, or what was in the notebooks that the United States government seized from his hotel room the morning after his death. You will, John Worrell Keeley, a mechanic from Philadelphia, who in the 1870s I demonstrated a motor that he claimed ran on the vibrational resonance of sound. A device that operated for years, was witnessed by dozens of credentialed observers, and attracted serious scientific attention before being dismissed as fraud after his death. Dismissed, that is, until investigators opened a hidden chamber beneath the floor of his workshop and found a system of pneumatic tubes and concealed machinery that raised a question no one has satisfactorily answered. If it was all a fraud, why was the hidden machinery not designed to power the device, but to make it impossible to explain? T. Henry Moray, a quiet, methodical electrical engineer in Salt Lake City, who in the 1920s built a suitcase-sized device he called the Radiant Energy Receiver. It required no external power. It connected to an antenna. It produced between 50 and 100 kilowatts of electrical output. Dozens of engineers, government officials, and scientists watched it operate. Many signed affidavits, and then someone stole the device's key component, and someone else shot at Moray through the window of his car, and today you have almost certainly never heard his name, Edwin Gray, an engineer in Los Angeles who, in the 1970s, developed a pulsed electromagnetic motor that appeared to produce more energy than it consumed. A device tested by engineers from major American corporations who could not explain the result. Gray was subsequently arrested on fraud charges that were later dropped. His laboratory was raided. His prototypes were seized. He died in 1989 with his work unfinished and unverified. And then there are the others, a longer list than this documentary can fully explore, stretching across decades and continents. Each story a variation on the same theme. Different countries, different decades, different technologies, the same walls, 5 men, 5 different corners of the world, 5 inventions that, if the documented record is to be believed, it should have changed everything. And all 5 gone, not lost to time or neglect, but gone in a way that has the texture of intention. The pattern is the argument. And to understand the pattern, you must first understand the man who cast the longest shadow across all of it. A man born in a lightning storm, a man who crossed an ocean with a single invention already fully formed inside his mind. A man who once made the Colorado skies rain artificial lightning just to prove a point. The story of the suppressed energy begins, as so many things do, with Nikola Tesla. The village of Smiljan sits in what is now Croatia, in a valley between low hills that catch the weather rolling in from the Adriatic. In the summer of 1856, the storms that cross those hills are spectacular. Wide, electrical, the kind that light the whole sky and make the ground tremble. On the 10th of July of that year, as one of those storms moved directly overhead, a woman named Juka Tesla went into labor, and by the time the lightning stopped, a boy had been born. The midwife looked at the sky and then at the child, and according to at least one account that Tesla himself recalled in his autobiography, she said something to the effect that he had come into the world as a creature of the storm. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the observation proved accurate in ways that no midwife could have intended, because Nikola Tesla would spend his entire life in a kind of conversation with electricity, not metaphorically, but literally, perceptually, in a way that defied anything his contemporaries could fully explain. Tesla described his own mind in the autobiographical writings he produced late in life with unusual precision. He was not simply interested in electricity. He perceived it. He described a capacity for what he called visualization, so complete that he could assemble and test a machine entirely inside his own mind, run it through its full operational cycle, identify the points of friction and failure, and emerge from the internal experiment with a design already optimized for construction. He did not need drawings. He did not need models. The model lived in his head with a fidelity that he described as indistinguishable from physical reality. And this was not unusual, recall, or exceptional spatial reasoning. Though he had both, it was something more specific, a sensitivity to the electromagnetic texture of the world that seems, reading his descriptions, almost neurological. He wrote of perceiving electrical fields as physical sensations, not pain, but a quality of awareness, like the feeling of a familiar sound heard in an unfamiliar key. He could feel, he claimed, the resonant properties of objects simply by handling them. He noticed patterns in numbers and geometric structures that others processed as abstract, and he experienced as almost tactile. His childhood experiments were a natural consequence of this perception. He harnessed insects to tiny hand-built machines, trying to convert biological energy into mechanical rotation, not as a child's game, but as a genuine inquiry into the conversion of one energy form to another. He began filling notebooks before he was 12, and by the time he reached his teens, the notebooks contained mathematical observations that his school teachers could not always follow. He left Serbia for Budapest in the early 1880s, then moved to Paris, working as an engineer while continuing his private theoretical work. It was in Paris that the key insight arrived, not slowly, over years of development, but in a single moment, while walking in a park at sunset. He later described it as a kind of revelation, the complete design of a rotating magnetic field motor, fully realized in a flash, the physics self-evident and the engineering immediately obvious. He stopped walking. He picked up a stick and drew the diagram in the dirt, and then he stood back and looked at what he had drawn and understood that he was looking at something that did not yet exist in the world, but should. He arrived in New York in 1884, carrying almost nothing, and in his pocket a letter of introduction to a man named Thomas Edison. That meeting had the most consequential and destructive professional encounter in the history of technology, is where this story takes its first dark turn. To understand what happened between Tesla and Edison, you need to understand something that most simplified accounts of their rivalry miss entirely. Edison was not a villain. He was something far more instructive. A businessman who had already won and who understood with perfect clarity that winning in the energy business was not about having the best technology. It was about being the technology that everyone had already installed. By the time Tesla arrived at his laboratory in 1884, Edison had already built an entire electrical infrastructure in Lower Manhattan based on direct current, DC electricity, which flows in one direction like water in a pipe. It worked, it lit bulbs, it ran motors, it made money. The problem, and it was a significant problem that Tesla saw immediately, was that DC current could not travel more than about a mile before losing most of its power to resistance. To serve a city with DC electricity, you needed a power station every mile. Edison's system required a dense, expensive network of local generators. Tesla's alternating current system, AC electricity, which reverses direction many times per second, did not have this limitation. Using transformers, AC power could be stepped up to extremely high voltages for long-distance transmission and then stepped down again at the point of use, losing almost nothing along the way. One power station could serve a region. One grid could serve a country. The economic and practical advantages were not marginal. They were overwhelming. Edison knew this, and so he did something that is rarely taught in the standard account of the Industrial Revolution. He waged a deliberate, systematic, scientifically dishonest public campaign to discredit Tesla's technology. He held public demonstrations in which he electrocuted animals, dogs, calves, and eventually an elephant named Topsy, using alternating current telling the assembled audiences that this was the fate awaiting anyone who let Tesla's system into their homes. He lobbied politicians. He planted misleading stories in newspapers. He attempted to have the word Tesla adopted as a slang term for electrocution, a campaign that fortunately for history failed. He also, it should be noted, broke a financial promise to Tesla directly. Tesla had been hired to improve Edison's DC dynamos and had been offered a bonus of $50,000, a life-changing sum, when the work was complete. When Tesla finished the work, Edison told him the offer had been a joke, that he didn't understand American humor. Tesla resigned. But here is what this episode taught Tesla, and it is the lesson that the rest of his life was shaped by. The world does not adopt superior technology on the merits of the technology. It adopts technology on the merits of the economic interests already invested in the inferior version. Scientific truth and commercial truth are not the same truth, and in any collision between them, the money wins. This is the moment the documentary's central argument is born. Not in a conspiracy, not in a dark room, but in the ordinary transaction of a powerful man protecting an investment by any means available. Tesla walked away from Edison's laboratory poorer but not broken. He walked away with a clarity about the world that would shape everything he did next. In the background of all of this, watching with great interest, was a man named J.P. Morgan, the financier whose portfolio spanned copper wire, coal, railway infrastructure, and banking. And Morgan had invested heavily in Edison's DC infrastructure. He was watching the war of currents with the calculated attention of someone who understood that the outcome would determine the shape of the American energy economy for decades. His name will return, but first, Tesla, freed from Edison, funded by new investors, and carrying the electromagnetic design of the century inside his head, began to build something that would make the war of currents look, in retrospect, like a very small argument about a very small thing. The laboratory that Tesla built outside Colorado Springs in the spring of 1899 was, by any reasonable standard, insane. It was a wooden barn, roughly 60 feet square, sitting on a patch of scrubland at altitude with the Rocky Mountains as a backdrop and one of the most electrically active skies on the continent directly above it. From a distance, it looked ordinary. Up close, rising through the roof and into the air above it, was a copper-tipped antenna mast 80 feet tall, and inside, filling most of the floor space, was a Tesla coil of a scale that had never been built before, a resonance transformer designed not to generate electricity, but to amplify it, to take an input signal and tune it to a frequency so specific, so precisely calibrated, that it would propagate not through air and not through wire, but through the earth itself. Tesla called what he was attempting world resonance. The principle was this: the earth is a conductor, not a perfect conductor, but a conductor. And like all conductors, it has a natural resonant frequency, a rate at which electrical energy can travel through it and bounce back from the other side in perfect phase alignment, reinforcing itself rather than cancelling. If you could find that frequency, and Tesla believed he could calculate it from basic physics, and if you could inject electrical energy into the earth at exactly that frequency. The energy would propagate around the planet the way sound propagates through a tuning fork. It would not diminish with distance in the usual way. It would maintain itself. And at any point on the Earth's surface, a receiver tuned to that same frequency could extract that energy from the ground beneath it. The experiment that Tesla conducted on a night in July 1899 is one of the most documented and least discussed events in the history of electrical engineering. His assistant, George Scherf, who kept independent records of the Colorado Springs work, noted in his own log that Tesla had spent most of that day adjusting the coil's resonant frequency with a precision that required dozens of minute calibrations. By nightfall, the laboratory was vibrating, not metaphorically, physically vibrating. The walls and floor trembling with the standing electrical waves that Tesla's notes describe propagating through the earth beneath the building. Then Tesla activated the transmitter at full power and walked outside to where 200 incandescent bulbs had been placed in a field 25 miles from the laboratory, connected to nothing, no wires, no batteries, nothing but rods pushed into the ground at their base. The bulbs lit, not dimly, not flickering. They lit, all 200 of them, with the steady, reliable glow of a properly powered lamp. Von Tesla stood in the field and looked at 200 lights burning in the darkness, without a single wire connecting them to any source of electricity. And he wrote in his notebook the following morning, "The demonstration is complete. The earth is a conductor. The resonance principle holds its scale. The world system is not a theory. It is an engineering problem." He was 53 years old. He had demonstrated wireless power transmission over 25 miles, using the earth itself as the conductor. He packed his instruments into cases, closed his notebooks, and began the journey back to New York. He already knew what he was going to build next. Before this documentary moves from Tesla's Colorado discoveries to the physical structure he built on Long Island to embody them, it is worth pausing here. Now, because there is a dimension of Tesla's thinking that most accounts of his life miss entirely, a philosophical framework that was in many ways more threatening to the established order than any device he ever built. Tesla published an essay in 1900 in the Century magazine titled "The Problem of Increasing Human Energy." It is not widely read today. It should be, because in that essay, Tesla laid out a vision of civilization and energy that is so precise in its analysis and so radical in its conclusions that reading it now, more than a century later, is a disorienting experience. Not because it seems dated, but because it seems prophetic. Tesla's argument was this: energy is the master resource from which all other human capacities derive. Not money, not territory, not military strength, energy. Every advance in human civilization, from the first controlled fire to the steam engine to the electrical grid, has been fundamentally an advance in the human ability to access, convert, and apply energy. And every form of human suffering, poverty, hunger, disease, war, is, at its root, a consequence of energy scarcity or energy inequality. From this premise, Tesla derived a conclusion that was, in 1900, essentially revolutionary. if energy could be made universally available, not sold, not distributed through a metered infrastructure, but made as accessible as the air itself, the entire economic engine of human suffering would lose its fuel. War, in the sense of conflict over resources, would become economically irrational. Poverty, defined as inability to access the material requirements of life, would become physically impossible. The inequality between nations, which in 1900 was stark and was already being driven in large part by differential access to energy-intensive industrial processes, would begin to collapse. Tesla was not writing science fiction. He was applying basic systems analysis to the problem of civilization, and his solution was not political or economic. It was electromagnetic, free, wireless, globally available electrical energy, the Wardenclyffe system, the world system, not a utility, a commons. You can see immediately why this was dangerous, not just to the men who owned the coal mines and the copper wire and the power stations, though it was certainly dangerous to them. It was dangerous to any conception of the world in which energy was a commodity, in which scarcity could be manufactured, in which the provision of power was a thing that could be owned and priced and withheld. Tesla's greatest invention was not the rotating magnetic field or the Tesla coil or the system of alternating current. Extraordinary as all of these were, his greatest invention was the idea that energy should belong to everyone, that it was, by its physical nature, a commons, as free as air, as universal as gravity, as fundamentally incompatible with private ownership as the light of the sun. And that idea was the most dangerous thing he ever created. Drive out to Shoreham, Long Island, today, and you will find a flat, quiet expanse of grass, a small museum, and a historical marker. In 1901, you would have found something almost impossible to explain if you had not been told what you were looking at. Rising from the farmland was a wooden tower 187 feet tall, topped with a copper hemisphere 55 tons in weight that sat on its peak like a misplaced moon, catching the light differently at each hour of the day. Around its base, workmen were digging, not a foundation in the ordinary sense, but a system of tunnels and chambers extending deep into the earth, lined with copper pipe, designed to interface the tower's electrical system with the conducting layers of the soil beneath. From a distance, it looked like nothing that had ever been built before, which was accurate, because nothing like it had ever been built before. Tesla called it Wardenclyffe after James Warden, the businessman, whose land it occupied. But the name Tesla, used in his own notes and correspondence, was the world system, because what he was building was not a radio tower, not a power station, and not an antenna in any conventional sense. It was an interface between the electromagnetic energy of the earth and the civilization that sat on top of it. The design documents that Tesla produced for Wardenclyffe, many of which survive in the Tesla Museum in Belgrade in his original hand, some in English and some in Serbian, describe a system of extraordinary ambition. The tower would transmit electrical power wirelessly across the planet, using the Earth's resonant cavity as a conductor, exactly as the Colorado Springs experiments had demonstrated in prototype. But it would also simultaneously transmit wireless communication, not commercial telegraphy, in the way Marconi was developing it, but a genuinely universal system, free, open, accessible to any receiver on Earth tuned to the correct frequency, weather data, navigation signals, the news, music. He was describing the internet in 1901. The copper dome was not decorative, it was functional, a terminal capacitor designed to interface with the ionosphere, the electrically charged layer of the upper atmosphere that forms one wall of the Earth's electromagnetic resonant cavity. Tesla's design relied on using the Earth and the ionosphere as the two conductors of a vast electromagnetic circuit, with Wardenclyffe as the point of injection. The tunnels beneath the tower were not structural, they were electrical, a root system of copper reaching into the conducting strata of the Earth below. J.P. Morgan provided the initial funding for Wardenclyffe, and $150,000, an enormous sum in 1901, in exchange for a controlling interest in any patents that emerged from the work. Morgan understood the project as a wireless telegraphy venture, a competitor to Marconi's emerging system, with clear commercial revenue from message transmission fees. He did not yet understand what Tesla was actually building. One morning, in the winter of 1902, an assistant who worked at the tower site described watching Tesla stand at the base of the structure and look upward toward the copper dome, his face carrying what the assistant would later describe as an expression of absolute certainty, not the satisfaction of a man who has finished something, but the recognition of a man who is standing in the presence of something true. He stood there for several minutes without speaking. Then he walked backside. Morgan's letter of inquiry arrived on Tesla's desk that same winter, and Tesla's reply was the beginning of the end. The question was simple. J.P. Morgan, a man accustomed to receiving satisfactory answers to simple questions, asked Tesla to explain in clear terms how investors would profit from the Wardenclyffe system once it was operational, not in the long run, not in the abstract, not in the language of civilizational transformation that Tesla favored. In cash terms, on a timeline, with a mechanism. Tesla's response has been described by historians who have studied the original correspondence as somewhere between idealistic and bewildering, depending on your perspective. He described a system of selective access, receivers that could be enabled or disabled remotely, a kind of licensing scheme applied to the transmissions. But the fundamental problem was structural. The Wardenclyffe system, if it worked as designed, would inject electrical power into the Earth's resonant cavity in a way that made it available simultaneously and without discrimination to any receiver on Earth tuned to the correct frequency. The energy, once transmitted, could not be directed to paying customers only. It would be as available to a farmer in rural India as to a factory owner in New York, as accessible to a child in a village with no infrastructure as to a bank in a city with every infrastructure. A. Morgan reportedly summarized the problem in a single question, a question that has echoed through the history of energy technology ever since. Where do we put the meter? Whether or not Morgan said exactly those words, The question they encapsulate is precise and devastating. A metered world is a world in which access to energy is a transaction. A world of free wireless power is a world in which that transaction ceases to exist. And J.P. Morgan had invested enormously in the infrastructure of the metered world: copper wire, coal supply, power distribution, the entire physical apparatus of an energy economy built on the premise that electricity was a product to be manufactured, transmitted through proprietary channels, and sold. It is worth being precise about Morgan's position here, because this documentary does not require him to be a villain. His logic was entirely rational within the framework of the world he had built. He had taken a risk with his capital. He expected a return, and Tesla's actual ambitions for Wardenclyffe made a commercial return structurally impossible. From a purely financial perspective, Morgan's withdrawal of support was as sensible as any investor declining to fund a business model with no revenue mechanism. Then the problem that echoes through everything that follows, is that the framework within which Morgan's logic was rational was a framework that treated energy as a commodity. And the question of whether energy should be a commodity is not a financial question, it is a civilizational one. Morgan and Tesla were not arguing about a business model. They were arguing, without fully articulating it, about the nature of the world. In Morgan's world was one in which access to fundamental resources was a transaction. Tesla's world was one in which access to fundamental resources was a right. And in the early 1900s, as in the early 2000s, as now, it was Morgan's world that had the money. Construction at Wardenclyffe continued through 1902 and into 1903. Driven by Tesla's increasingly desperate search for alternative funding, he wrote to dozens of potential investors. He gave interviews. He published articles. He did everything a man can do when he knows he is running out of time. And the thing he is trying to save is not his career or his fortune, but the future. Between 1901 and 1904, while the financial negotiations between Tesla and Morgan deteriorated, the Wardenclyffe Tower was not idle. Tesla was conducting experiments. The results of those experiments, what was recorded, what was witnessed, and what was never fully explained, represent one of the most genuinely strange chapters in the history of electrical engineering. Local residents in the village of Shoreham and the surrounding area began reporting unusual phenomena on evenings when they could see the tower lit and active. Metal objects in homes near the tower, tools, cutlery, the frames of mirrors, vibrated at a low frequency, producing a humming that was reported as unsettling but not painful. A cluster of gas lamps on a road running adjacent to the Wardenclyffe property were reportedly seen glowing on multiple occasions when the gas had not been lit and when no electrical connection existed to the tower's system. A fisherman named Arthur Roberts, who gave a statement to a local newspaper in the summer of 1903, he reported that the hull of his metal boat had become markedly electrified during a night passage through the waters of Long Island Sound nearest to the tower's location, electrified to a degree that caused visible sparking when he touched metal fittings, and that persisted for several hours after he had moved away from the area. None of these accounts were formally investigated. The newspaper articles in which they appeared were filed and forgotten. Tesla's own notebooks from this period are less reticent. In a sequence of entries from the autumn of 1903, he describes what he calls world resonance, in terms that suggest it was not merely a theoretical achievement, but a physical, measurable, felt reality. He writes of the coil vibrating in harmony with the earth, of standing at the tower's base and feeling the ground itself transmit a rhythm upward through the soles of his feet. He describes sending a signal and receiving its reflection, not through air, not through conventional electromagnetic propagation, but through the earth, bounced from the opposite side of the planet and returned. He notes the timing of the return, calculates from it the propagation velocity through the Earth's conductive strata, and arrives at a figure that corresponds with modern measurements of the phenomenon he was observing. The Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic standing wave that exists between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere, and that maintains a fundamental frequency of 7.83 Hz, was not formally described by the scientific community until 1952, when the German physicist Winfried Schumann published his theoretical calculation of it. Tesla's Colorado Springs notebooks contain experimental measurements from 1899 that correspond to this frequency with remarkable precision, and Tesla knew about this cavity more than 50 years before the mainstream scientific community documented. So here is the question the Wardenclyffe experiments leave us with, and it is a question that is worth sitting with. If the phenomena Tesla was observing were simply delusion, if his notebooks were fantasies, his witnesses mistaken, and his instruments poorly calibrated, then why did the people with the most to lose from his success spend so much money and effort ensuring that the tower never operated at full capacity? You do not pour concrete into an empty hole. You do not classify documents that contain nothing. You do not send agents to seize the papers of a dead man whose work was merely absurd. The experiments were real. The question is what they proved. In November of 1906, a letter arrived at Tesla's laboratory in New York. It came from J.P. Morgan's office at 23 Wall Street, written in the careful, formal language of a man who has made his decision and does not expect to revisit it. The substance of the letter was brief. Morgan would provide no further funding for the Wardenclyffe project. The commercial case had not been made. The project's revenue model remained unclear. He wished Tesla well. That is not quite what the letter said, but it is the meaning of what it said, translated into plain language from the language of finance, which is always the most effective kind of burial, the burial that uses the terminology of ordinary business to close the lid on something extraordinary. Tesla wrote back. Then he wrote back again. He spent the next several years pursuing alternative funding with the energy of a man who knows precisely what is at stake, writing to industrialists, European investors, scientific foundations, and government officers. None of them responded with money. The Wardenclyffe site, unable to meet its debts, fell into foreclosure. Construction stopped. The tower stood, copper dome dull against the Long Island sky, 187 feet of potential that was slowly converting into ruin. Then In the summer of 1917, a crew of workers arrived at Wardenclyffe with equipment designed not to repair the tower, but to demolish it. The official explanation was straightforward. The United States had entered the First World War, and the tower represented a potential navigation aid for enemy submarines. It was a security risk. The tower had been non-functional for over a decade. It had not transmitted a signal in years. Whatever security risk it might once have posed had long since evaporated. But the demolition proceeded. And here is the detail that makes the demolition something other than simple wartime caution. The tunnels that Tesla had excavated beneath the tower, the copper-lined resonance chambers that formed the system's interface with the Earth's conducting strata, were not left open. They were filled with concrete, permanently, at considerable expense. You fill an underground chamber with concrete for one reason, because you want to ensure that nothing that was in it can ever be reconstructed. An empty hole is an opportunity. A hole full of concrete is a message. Tesla, who watched the demolition from New York, wrote nothing in his notebooks about it. His correspondence from the period suggests a man who has moved past grief into something more enclosed. He continued to write and theorize. He continued to imagine the future, but the physical embodiment of his vision, the copper dome, the resonance chambers, the root system reaching into the conducting earth, was rubble. He lived another 26 years. He spent most of them alone in a succession of hotel rooms, feeding pigeons from the window, refusing visitors, writing letters to a future he no longer entirely believed would come. He died on the 7th of January, 1943, in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker at the age of 86. The next morning, agents from the United States Office of Alien Property arrived at the hotel and removed everything in his room, every notebook, every blueprint, and every manuscript, every scrap of paper on which anything had been written. They boxed it, catalogued it as enemy property, and transported it to a government facility where it was classified. He had lived in the United States for 60 years. He had given the country its electrical grid, and in death, the government called his work alien property and took it. Some of what was seized has since been released. Some of it has not. And the classification of certain portions of Tesla's seized papers has never been lifted. Ask yourself what they were protecting. The year is 1917. America has entered the war, and in the early morning hours on Long Island, a crew of hired laborers approaches a tower that has been standing, silent and unfunded, for over a decade. They have been contracted to bring it down. They have brought acetylene torches, ropes, and a conviction that the job will be finished before dark. And the official explanation, as previously noted, was security. The tower was a potential navigation beacon for German U-boats operating in the Atlantic. The government had issued the order. The creditor had cooperated. The demolition was legal, documented, and in every formal sense, entirely above board. But let us look more carefully at the specifics of what was demolished and how. The tower itself, the visible, above-ground structure, was indeed dangerous to remove. The copper dome was heavy. The wooden frame had been standing for 15 years in the salt air of Long Island. and the demolition required careful sequencing to avoid injury. This was accomplished over several days. No one disputes this part. What is more interesting is what happened to what the tower was connected to. Beneath the Wardenclyffe site, Tesla had excavated a system of shafts and chambers reaching deep into the earth, lined with copper pipe and designed to conduct electrical energy into the Earth's resonant strata. These chambers were not structural. They had no load-bearing function. The tower could have been demolished without touching them. A security assessment could have been satisfied by dismantling the above-ground transmitter. Instead, the below-ground components were specifically targeted and filled with concrete. Not rubble, not soil, not simple backfill. Concrete, the permanent, structural, intent declaring choice of a person who wants something to be over and to remain over. The chambers were sealed. The copper root system was entombed. The earth was closed over the evidence. This decision to fill those chambers with concrete is the detail that changes the character of the demolition from pragmatic, wartime security measure to something that requires a different word. The demolition of the tower dealt with a visible problem. The concrete in the chambers dealt with an invisible one, and you only deal with an invisible problem if you know the invisible problem exists. Tesla understood this distinction. His letters from the period do not discuss the demolition of the tower with anger or surprise. They discuss it with the tone of a man who had been expecting something of this kind for years, and who had already made his peace with the loss of the physical structure. What he mentions, briefly and without elaboration, is the below-ground work, the resonance chambers, the copper interface with the earth. He writes that those chambers represented the heart of the system, not the tower, the ground. Whatever was in those chambers is now permanently inaccessible, entombed under a flat expanse of Long Island that has, since the 1960s, housed a small science and technology laboratory. The irony of this location is noted in the Tesla Museum's documentation of the site. It was not lost on the people who chose it. What the demolition crew was destroying that morning was not a steel and wood transmission tower. They were destroying the most concrete, physical, undeniable proof in existence that Tesla's system had been built, had worked in partial prototype, and could, given appropriate funding and freedom, have been scaled. A working prototype, even an incomplete one, is more dangerous than any theory. Theories can be dismissed. Structures filled with concrete cannot. To understand why Wardenclyffe was demolished, not just tolerated into ruin, but actively destroyed, you need to understand the full economic landscape of 1917 American energy. And to understand that landscape, you need to understand the two men who between them had built it. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled at its peak approximately 90% of all oil refining in the United States. And this was not a figure that emerged by accident or by superior efficiency alone. It was the product of systematic acquisition, legal pressure, and in some cases outright sabotage of competitors. A campaign so comprehensive that it resulted in the landmark antitrust case of 1911 that broke Standard Oil into 34 separate companies. But breaking the formal legal entity did not break the underlying network of interests. the relationships, the boards, the investment portfolios, the fundamental economic logic that had built them. Rockefeller and his successors remained among the most powerful figures in the American energy economy through the second and third decades of the 20th century. Morgan's empire was different in form, but identical in logic. Where Rockefeller controlled the production end of the energy economy, the oil in the ground, the refineries, and the distribution networks, Morgan controlled the financial infrastructure that made the energy economy possible. His banks financed the coal mines, the copper wire manufacturers, the power stations, and the construction of the physical infrastructure of electrification. His investment portfolio contained, in one form or another, a stake in almost every component of the system by which Americans accessed energy. The value of these investments, their entire value, and measured in hundreds of millions of dollars in 1901 money, rested on a single foundational assumption: that energy was a commodity, that it was produced by the burning of things, transmitted through physical infrastructure, and sold to consumers through a metering system. Tesla's world system was not merely a business competitor to this model. It was the negation of the model's foundational assumption. And if energy could be transmitted wirelessly through the Earth's resonant cavity and accessed freely by any receiver on the planet, then coal had no value as an energy source. Copper wire had no value as a transmission medium. Power stations had no value as generation infrastructure. The entire physical apparatus of the American energy economy, every mine, every refinery, every power line, every meter, would become worthless overnight. This is not hyperbole. This is basic economic logic. And the men who had spent their careers building this empire were perfectly capable of recognizing it. The crucial point, the point that distinguishes this documentary's argument from simple conspiracy theory, is that Morgan and Rockefeller didn't need to coordinate. Their financial interests were so completely and structurally aligned with the suppression of Tesla's technology that no explicit agreement was necessary. No secret meeting was required. No sinister compact was signed. Each man, acting on perfectly rational self-interest within the framework of the economic system he had built, would arrive independently at the same conclusion: that Wardenclyffe could not be allowed to succeed. This is the mechanism that makes the suppression of free energy technology not merely possible, but inevitable, within a system that treats energy as a commodity, not villainy, incentive. An incentive, unlike conspiracy, leaves no fingerprints. In the long, quiet final years of Tesla's life, after Wardenclyffe was demolished and the funding had dried and the visitors had stopped coming, he continued to work. Not in a laboratory, he no longer had one. In his rooms at the Hotel New Yorker, at a desk covered with papers and calculations, by the window where the pigeons that he loved gathered on the sill, he worked. The work of his final decade was peculiar in character. It was not experimental. He had no equipment. It was not purely theoretical. It was too specific, too operational, even for that description. It was something closer to documentation. A systematic, meticulous record of everything he had discovered and not been able to build, written in a style that suggests a man preparing instructions for someone who will arrive after him. His letters from this period, the ones that have been made public, at least, range across an extraordinary spectrum. Some are visionary, describing energy systems and communication technologies that read now like straightforward predictions of things that have since been built. Some are personal, describing the loneliness of a life that had been defined by ideas that the world was not yet ready for. And some are technical, deeply, specifically technical, describing the operational parameters of systems that Tesla could no longer build, but clearly believed someone eventually would. One letter, in particular, written in 1937 and addressed to a young engineer in California whose name history has not preserved, was described by one of the engineers who subsequently studied it as a complete operational manual for the Wardenclyffe system, more precise and more detailed than any of Tesla's published work, written as if for someone who intended to construct the system rather than simply understand it. The letter described the below-ground resonance chambers, the tuning procedure for the coil to the expected output parameters, the safety protocols. It read, by the account of those who saw it, like a set of construction plans. That letter was among the documents seized from Tesla's hotel room the morning after his death in January 1943. What follows from this fact is not comfortable to consider. Tesla spent the last years of his life writing down everything he knew about a system that had been demolished, in letters addressed to people who might one day build it again. And those letters were taken by the government before any of those people had a chance to receive them. The chain of knowledge from Tesla's mind to the page to the hands of someone who could act on it was severed at the page. He had no family, no students in the formal sense, no institution that claimed his intellectual legacy. The Tesla Society in Belgrade did its best with what it had, which was the material Tesla had deposited there before his death. Significant, but not complete. The complete record of what Tesla knew, as of the morning of January 8th, 1943, exists in a government archive whose full contents have never been disclosed. He was 86 years old. He had been in America for 60 years. He had given the country its electrical grid and its radio communication. He had demonstrated wireless power transmission before the century turned. He had designed and partially built a system that, had it been completed, it would have changed the nature of the human relationship to energy in a way that no subsequent technology has come close to. He died alone in a hotel room, in the company of pigeons. In the decades that followed, across 3 continents and 4 generations, other men picked up the thread and were met with the same silence, the same walls, and sometimes something worse. Every working democracy has, embedded in its legal infrastructure, a mechanism for deciding what knowledge is allowed to be public. In the United States, this mechanism is called Section 181 of the Patent Act, formerly known as the Invention Secrecy Act. It was passed in 1951. It allows the government, specifically any agency with a national security function, to classify any patent application as secret, prohibiting the inventor from discussing, publishing, or developing the technology without explicit government authorization. The number of patents currently held under this Act is not published. Freedom of information. Requests on the subject have returned, responses confirming that the number runs into the thousands. Estimates from the Patent and Trademark Office suggest it is in the neighborhood of 5,000 active secrecy orders at any given time. The breakdown of these patents by technology category is not available to the public. You are allowed to know that the law exists and that it is being applied, sir, but not to know what is in the files it protects. The legal apparatus for suppressing technological innovation in the public interest or in someone's interest exists, is documented, and is actively used. This is not speculation. This is statute law. Among the inventors who encountered this apparatus directly, one name stands out for the credibility of its circumstances: Eugene Malov. He was not, by any definition, a fringe figure. He had a degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from MIT. He had worked as a science journalist, covering mainstream physics with the rigor and skepticism of someone trained to detect bad experimental methodology from across the room. When the cold fusion announcement came out of the University of Utah in 1989, Malov was at MIT, and his initial reaction was the same as most of the scientific establishment's: skepticism. But Malov did something that most of his colleagues did not do. He looked at the data, he looked at the methodology of the debunking campaigns as carefully as he had looked at the original claim, and he became convinced, not emotionally, not ideologically, but through the same methodological rigor he applied to everything else, that the dismissal of cold fusion had been motivated by something other than the experimental evidence. He left MIT. He founded a journal called Infinite Energy, which reviewed and published alternative energy research from a standpoint of genuine scientific skepticism, skeptical of both the mainstream consensus and of overclaimed alternative results. In the 15 years he ran the journal, it became the most credible voice in the field precisely because of its refusal to be credulous. In May 2004, Malov announced publicly that he was close to releasing findings that he described as significant. He did not specify the nature of those findings. 17 days later, he was found beaten to death at a property in Norwich, Connecticut. He was 56 years old. The case has never been solved. No one has ever been charged. The research he was preparing to announce was never released. There is a law that allows the government to classify inventions. There is a man who spent his life documenting suppressed energy research, and there is an unsolved murder. You are allowed to decide what, if anything, connects those three facts. The peer review system is one of the genuinely great inventions of modern civilization. The idea that scientific claims should be evaluated not by authority, not by reputation, not by the social status of the person making them, but by the quality of the experimental methodology and the reproducibility of the results, is an idea that has produced more reliable knowledge about the physical world than all the centuries of philosophical speculation that preceded it. It is also, like all human institutions, imperfect in ways that matter, and in the specific case of energy technology, that contradicts foundational assumptions of thermodynamics. Those imperfections become, as we will see, effectively absolute. Here is how the mechanism works. A researcher submits a paper to a peer-reviewed journal describing anomalous energy output from a device. The editor of that journal assigns the paper to reviewers, typically 2 or 3, who are experts in the relevant field. In the case of an energy device claiming anomalous output, the relevant field is electrical engineering and thermodynamics. The reviewers are, by the nature of the appointment, people who have built careers on the understanding that energy cannot be created from nothing, and that any device claiming output in excess of input violates the first law of thermodynamics. Before they read the methodology, before they examine the experimental data, before they assess the calibration of the instruments, they know that the result cannot be correct, and so they look for the methodological error, and they always find one, because in any experiment of sufficient complexity, there is always something that could have been done differently. This is not bad faith, it is not conspiracy. It is the ordinary operation of a paradigm, the set of background assumptions within which scientists work, and which defines what counts as a legitimate result before any result is examined. Thomas Kuhn described this mechanism 50 years ago in the structure of scientific revolutions. It is not a controversial observation. It is the established sociology of scientific knowledge. What it means in practice for inventors and researchers working in areas that challenge foundational assumptions is this: the peer review system will not give you a fair hearing, not because reviewers are dishonest, but because the architecture of legitimate knowledge is constructed in a way that prevents certain results from being considered results at all. Thomas Henry Moray demonstrated this at the most practical possible level. In the 1920s, working in his laboratory in Salt Lake City, Moray built and repeatedly demonstrated a device that produced measurable electrical output from no conventional source. And among the witnesses to these demonstrations were credentialed engineers from the United States Bureau of Standards, the federal agency responsible for the calibration and verification of measurement instruments in America. Those engineers watched the device operate, examined it for concealed power sources, and signed affidavits confirming that they could identify no conventional explanation for the observed output. Moray submitted his findings for academic review. He received no response. He applied for a patent. The application was returned without examination on the grounds that the device was impossible. He was never able to publish his work in any peer-reviewed venue. And then someone stole the device's key component, broke into his laboratory, and shot at his car. The institutions failed first. The violence came second. What follows requires a specific kind of attention, not credulity, not dismissal, but the careful, evidence-sensitive attention of someone looking at a body of documented testimony and asking what it can and cannot support. Multiple independent energy inventors across the 20th century have described, on the record in published accounts and in sworn testimony, visits from unidentified individuals following the announcement of their research. These accounts share specific, recurring features. The visitors wore civilian clothing, rather than uniforms. They did not produce identification. They made offers of financial compensation, followed by explicit or implicit threats when those offers were declined, and in several cases they either facilitated or directly conducted the physical seizure of research materials. The accounts come from different countries, different decades, different technological contexts. The similarities are not borrowed from each other, they are independent convergences on the same pattern. Stanley Meyer was an engineer from Grove City, Ohio. In the 1980s and early 1990s, he developed and publicly demonstrated a water fuel cell, a device that used pulsed electromagnetic resonance to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, with, he claimed, an efficiency far greater than conventional electrolysis, making hydrogen on demand as a fuel source economically viable. He demonstrated the device publicly on many occasions, including a demonstration vehicle that he drove on public roads and presented to audiences. He was awarded 6 U.S. patents. He appeared on mainstream television. He was taken seriously, for a time, by people with engineering credentials. In the spring of 1998, Meyer was at a restaurant in his hometown, meeting with representatives from the Belgian and Canadian governments, who were reportedly interested in licensing his technology. He became suddenly and violently ill during the meal, walked outside, and died in the parking lot. He was 57 years old. The official cause of death was a brain aneurysm. No investigation was conducted into the circumstances of the meal or the identities of the individuals he had been meeting. John Bedini developed a pulsed electromagnetic motor in California in the late 1970s that he claimed demonstrated anomalous energy characteristics. He demonstrated it publicly, published his designs openly, and encouraged other engineers to replicate his work. His laboratory was broken into on multiple occasions. Prototypes were destroyed or stolen. He described in interviews that are documented and available, visits from men who did not identify themselves and who he understood, from the character of their questions, to have technical backgrounds inconsistent with ordinary commercial interest. Adam Trombley was a physicist who developed zero-point energy extraction devices in the early 1990s. During a live public demonstration of one of his devices, the device was seized by federal agents. The demonstration was not completed. The device has not been seen since. Trombley's description of the seizure, which he has given in multiple interviews, is consistent and specific. 3 cases, 3 different decades, 3 different technologies, 3 different countries, all arrived at independently, all describing the same pattern: announcement, interest, unidentified, visitors, offers, threats, seizure. You can look these cases up. The documentation exists. The question is not whether something happened, and the question is what pattern the something forms. Suppression is never total. This is the one consistent lesson of the history of ideas. The more aggressively a body of knowledge is pursued, the more deliberately it disperses. You cannot burn a library and expect the knowledge to die. You can only expect it to scatter. And scattered knowledge is in many ways more resilient than concentrated knowledge. A book locked in a vault is vulnerable. A book copied 1,000 times and distributed across 1,000 hands is not. The Tesla Museum in Belgrade holds approximately 150,000 original Tesla documents. This collection, notebooks, correspondence, experimental records, design drawings, represents the single largest surviving archive of Tesla's work and is the most comprehensive resource for anyone attempting to reconstruct the full scope of what he discovered. It is also, by the museum's own admission, only partially catalogued. Large portions of the collection have not been digitized. Significant portions have not been translated from Serbian, and the portions that have been studied in most detail are those that Tesla himself directed to the museum before his death, not notably the portions that the American government seized from his hotel room. In 1943, following Tesla's death, the Office of Alien Property assigned a government scientist to examine the seized papers and assess their significance. That scientist was Dr. John Trump, a professor of electrical engineering at MIT, and by biographical coincidence that various commentators have noted, without resolution, the uncle of the 45th President of the United States. Trump spent 3 days examining the papers. His official report concluded that they contain nothing that could be considered dangerous in the hands of a foreign power, and nothing that represented a departure from well-understood principles of physics. If that assessment was accurate, the papers could have been released immediately. They were not. They were classified for 3 decades. Some portions remained classified for longer. The process by which they were eventually released was partial and non-transparent, and the category of documents that remained classified was never specified. The logical conclusion available to a careful reader of this history is one of 2 things. Either the papers contain nothing significant, in which case their continued classification was bureaucratic inertia of the most wasteful kind, or the papers contained something significant, in which case the report saying they contain nothing was inaccurate. Neither possibility reflects well on the process, but only one of them is compatible with the concrete-filled chambers at Wardenclyffe, the seized materials from inventors across 3 subsequent decades, and the pattern that has been taking shape throughout this chapter. What did Tesla discover in Colorado Springs that was worth classifying for 30 years? The scientific chapter of this documentary will attempt to answer that question. The answer, it turns out, is not hidden in a file somewhere. It is written in the physics of the Earth itself, and it has been there, patiently waiting, since before there were humans to find it. Every time someone raises the possibility of free energy in a public conversation, they are met almost immediately with 2 words: thermodynamics laws, as if those 2 words constitute both an argument and a conclusion, a wall so solid that nothing further needs to be said or considered. The implication is that anyone who takes free energy seriously has not understood basic physics, and that anyone who has understood basic physics cannot take free energy seriously. This is a misrepresentation of what the laws of thermodynamics actually say, and it is worth being precise about it, because the misrepresentation is doing an enormous amount of work in this conversation. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy is conserved, that it cannot be created from nothing, and cannot be destroyed into nothing. It can only be converted from one form to another. This is a statement about closed systems, and it is as well confirmed as any law in physics. It is not being questioned. The second law of thermodynamics states that in any energy conversion process, some energy is lost as heat, that the entropy of a closed system always increases over time. Again, this is about closed systems. It is not being questioned. Here is what neither law says. They do not say that extracting energy from an ambient, external source is impossible. They say that creating energy from nothing is impossible. These are categorically different claims. The Earth is bathed in approximately 174 petawatts of solar energy every day. The magnetosphere channels an enormous flow of charged particles from the solar wind continuously into the Earth's upper atmosphere. Global lightning activity, approximately 100 strikes per second, every second, continuously, injects enormous quantities of electrical energy into the Earth's surface ionosphere cavity. The quantum vacuum, the fabric of space-time itself, contains a measurable, non-zero energy density that modern physics acknowledges, designates with a precise term, and has so far been unable to utilize commercially. None of these energy sources is nothing. All of them are real, physical, and measurable. And none of the laws of thermodynamics prohibit extracting energy from any of them. What the conventional argument against free energy actually amounts to is this: we have not yet demonstrated a commercially viable mechanism for extracting energy from ambient electromagnetic fields at useful scale. That is a true statement. It is an engineering statement about where we currently are, not a physical statement about where we can be. The laws of physics draw a line called impossible. The engineering frontier draws a different line called not yet. And confusing those two lines is one of the most consequential errors in the history of the energy conversation. Tesla was not trying to violate the laws of thermodynamics. He was trying to harvest energy from a source that was already there, the electromagnetic field of the Earth and its ionospheric cavity, the way a solar panel harvests energy from a source that was already there. The only difference is scale, and scale in engineering is always a solvable problem. There is a principle woven through every major free energy claim in this documentary's historical record, a thread connecting Tesla and Morey and Edwin Gray and John Bedini across the decades and across the ocean. It is not a complicated principle. It is, in fact, one of the most observable and intuitive phenomena in all of physics. It is called resonance. Take a wine glass and fill it to a precise level. Run a wet finger around the rim at the right speed, and you will produce a pure tone, the glass's resonant frequency. Now sing that tone loudly enough at the right pitch, and the glass will shatter, not because you added enormous energy to it, but because you added small amounts of energy at exactly the right frequency, the frequency at which the glass's own molecular structure amplifies the input. The glass broke itself. Your voice only provided the timing. This is the principle that makes a bridge dangerous to march soldiers across in step. It is why the ancient walls of Jericho appear in legend as falling to the sound of trumpets. It is why a radio receiver can extract a single signal from a crowded, electromagnetic spectrum, because it is tuned precisely and specifically to the frequency of the signal it wants, and that tuning allows it to draw energy from a signal so faint it would be unmeasurable by any other means. Resonance is the mechanism by which small inputs can access large stored energies, not by creating energy, by triggering its release from a system that was already carrying it. Tesla's Wardenclyffe system was fundamentally a resonance device. The tower and its below-ground root system were designed to operate at the Earth's own natural electromagnetic resonant frequency, the frequency of the standing wave that exists in the cavity between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. This frequency, now called the Schumann resonance after the physicist who formally characterized it in 1952, has a fundamental value of approximately 7.83 Hertz. Tesla measured it in 1899 and designed his world system around it. The physical principle is this: the Earth is a vast electromagnetic resonant cavity carrying enormous quantities of energy, continuously replenished by solar input and lightning activity. A transmitter tuned precisely to 7.83 Hertz and injecting energy into that cavity at that frequency does not fight the cavity's natural behavior, it joins it. And the energy propagates not by fighting the cavity's resistance, but by exploiting its resonance. And a receiver, anywhere on Earth's surface, tuned to the same frequency, can draw that energy back out the same way a tuning fork draws acoustic energy out of a room simply by being tuned. What is striking, and what constitutes a kind of physical argument in its own right, is that multiple independent inventors across the 20th century, working without knowledge of each other, arrived at this same resonance principle through different experimental routes. Morey's radiant energy receiver operated on tuned electromagnetic resonance. Edwin Gray's pulsed motor drew on the energy released during high-voltage electromagnetic discharges. Bedini's pulse motor extracted energy from electromagnetic transients. Different materials, different decades, different countries, same physics, the convergence of independent inventors on the same underlying principle is not the signature of shared delusion. It is the signature of a genuine physical effect waiting to be explained. Imagine the vacuum of outer space, not as popular imagery presents it, cold, black, completely empty, but as physics actually describes it, seething with activity, alive with fluctuations so rapid and so small that they are invisible to any ordinary instrument, but real, measurable, and impossible to remove no matter how thoroughly you attempt to evacuate a region of space. This is not poetry, this is quantum field theory, and it is the most precisely tested and most comprehensively confirmed theoretical framework in the history of physics. According to quantum field theory, the vacuum is not empty. It is a sea of zero-point fluctuations, pairs of virtual particles that blink in and out of existence billions of times per second, carrying energy that is not zero even at absolute zero temperature. This residual energy of the vacuum is called zero-point energy, and its existence is not speculative. It is a mathematical consequence of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. the same principle that governs the behavior of electrons in atoms and the spectrum of light emitted by stars. Here is the confirming experiment, and it is as clean and as definitive as any in physics. Take two flat metal plates. I place them extremely close together in a vacuum, a few nanometers apart. Nothing in between, no charge applied, no magnetic field. The plates move toward each other. They experience a measurable, attractive force with no conventional explanation. The force is called the Casimir effect. It was predicted theoretically by the Dutch physicist Hendrik Casimir in 1948, and it has been measured in laboratory settings with extraordinary precision. The force is produced by the differential pressure of 0-point fluctuations inside and outside the gap between the plates. The geometry of the gap excludes certain electromagnetic modes, creating an energy imbalance that produces a net inward force. The Casimir effect is standard university physics. It is in every serious quantum mechanics textbook. What the Casimir effect demonstrates is that 0-point energy is not merely a mathematical artifact. It is a physical reality that produces measurable forces in the laboratory. The energy density of the vacuum, estimated through various quantum field theory calculations, is by some measures the largest energy density in the universe. An ocean of potential so vast that extracting even a tiny fraction of it for practical use would represent a civilizational transformation. Harold Puthoff, a physicist at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Austin, has published multiple peer-reviewed papers on the theoretical basis for 0-point energy extraction. His work does not claim that a practical device exists. It claims that the physics does not prohibit such a device, that the known laws of quantum mechanics are not violated by the concept of a system that mediates between the 0-point field and a useful output. These papers exist. They were published. They were reviewed. The Casimir effect was formally characterized in 1948. In the same year, the United States government released a portion of the papers seized from Tesla's hotel room. The timing may be coincidental. The physics is not. Look at a globe of the Earth. Now imagine a second sphere, much larger, concentric, with the first, not solid, but a diffuse shell of charged particles at an altitude of approximately 60 to 1,000 kilometers above the surface. And this is the ionosphere, a region of the upper atmosphere where solar radiation has stripped electrons from atoms, creating a conducting plasma that wraps the planet in a second electromagnetic skin. Between the Earth's surface and the inner boundary of the ionosphere exists a cavity, the Earth ionosphere cavity, that functions as a resonant electromagnetic enclosure. Every second, approximately 100 lightning bolts strike the Earth's surface somewhere in the world, and each one injects a burst of electromagnetic energy into this cavity. Most of that energy dissipates, but a fraction of it resonates, propagating around the Earth and back, reinforcing itself at specific frequencies determined by the geometry of the cavity. The fundamental resonant frequency, as Winfried Schumann calculated in 1952, and as Tesla apparently measured in 1899, is approximately 7.83 Hertz. This is the Schumann resonance. It is not subtle. It is not theoretical. The Schumann resonance is continuously measurable, continuously present, continuously pumped with energy by the global lightning system. Monitoring stations around the world track it as a routine geophysical measurement. It fluctuates slightly with solar activity, with ionospheric conditions, and with the global distribution of thunderstorm activity. But it is always there, always at approximately 7.83 Hertz, always containing energy. Tesla's design for Wardenclyffe was not a plan to generate electrical energy. It was a plan to access electrical energy that already existed. The tower, tuned to the Schumann resonant frequency and interfaced with the Earth's conducting surface through the below-ground root system, was designed not as a generator, but as a gateway, a structured access point for energy that the Earth ionosphere cavity was already carrying and would continue to carry, regardless of whether any human structure was connected to it. The analogy is precise. Wardenclyffe was to the Earth's electromagnetic cavity what a hydroelectric dam is to a river. The river is not powered by the dam. The dam only captures what the river was already carrying. Remove the dam, and the river continues to flow. The energy does not belong to the dam. This is the image that closes the scientific arc of this documentary's 6th chapter. The Earth as a circuit, continuously energized, continuously resonating, humming at 7.83 Hertz, as it has for as long as lightning has been striking its surface. A circuit that has been running since before the first tree, before the first ocean, before the first cell of the first organism that would eventually produce a species clever enough to notice it. And in 1899, the one man stood on a mountain in Colorado, drove copper rods into the soil, and felt the whole planet vibrating beneath his feet. He knew then what he had found. The question that has haunted every chapter of this documentary is why the world was not allowed to know it with him. Salt Lake City, Utah, 1925. A man named Thomas Henry Morey sits in his laboratory on a winter afternoon, fine-tuning a device that fills about half the surface of a large work table. The device is a suitcase-sized assembly of vacuum, tubes, wire, a length of external antenna, and at its heart a crystalline element that Morey has produced himself through a process he has never fully disclosed, and which he refers to in his notes simply as the Swedish stone. The device is connected to nothing but the antenna. He deploys the antenna outside the window, throws a switch, and the device begins to produce electrical power. Not a little power, not a laboratory curiosity, but between 50 and 100 kilowatts of electrical power, enough to light a full house, run appliances, power industrial equipment. The output is steady, consistent, and repeatable. Morey has been achieving it in variations since the early 1920s. Over the next 2 decades, he demonstrates this device to an extraordinary range of witnesses, not friends and family, not credulous enthusiasts, engineers from the United States Bureau of Standards, the federal agency responsible for certifying measurement instruments, professors of electrical engineering from Utah State University, businessmen and investors who arrived with professional skeptics and left with signed affidavits, local government officials, scientists from the Edison Electric Institute, representatives of the Department of Interior. The affidavits exist. Many have been published. The accounts are consistent. Witnesses observed a device that produced substantial electrical output while connected only to an aerial and a ground, detected no concealed power source, and could offer no conventional explanation for the observed result. In one particularly rigorous demonstration, Moray transported the device to a location several miles from any power line and operated it there, having first buried it temporarily in the ground to allow inspection of its underside. It continued to produce power. The witnesses signed statements, and then, over the years that followed, the attempts began. His laboratory was broken into and equipment was damaged on multiple occasions. His patent applications were rejected without examination on the grounds that the device violated conservation of energy. His requests for independent institutional review were ignored or deflected. See, a communist agent, a man whose identity Moray documented, approached him with an offer to bring the technology to the Soviet Union. When Moray refused, the agent shot at his car with a handgun, the bullet coming close enough to graze the doorframe. The Swedish stone, the device's key active component, without which it could not function, was eventually stolen. Moray spent years attempting to recreate it and never fully succeeded. He died in 1974. The working device could not be reconstructed. For 20 years, in an ordinary city, in an ordinary laboratory, a man repeatedly and consistently demonstrated a device that did something the established order of physics and economics insisted was impossible. Dozens of credentialed witnesses confirmed it. And today you have almost certainly never heard his name. The story of John Hutchison begins not with a deliberate experiment, but with an accident, which is frequently how the most interesting physics begins. In 1979, Hutchison, a self-taught inventor and electronics enthusiast in Vancouver, Canada, was working in a laboratory he had assembled over years from salvaged equipment, much of it surplus military technology. Tesla coils, Van de Graaff generators, wave signal generators, high-frequency electromagnetic emitters of various kinds. He had positioned several of these devices in close proximity, running simultaneously, and was attempting to observe their combined electromagnetic field interactions when something unexpected happened. A metal bar on the other side of the room rose from its surface. Not slightly, not ambiguously. It rose clearly and repeatably when the devices were operating in a specific configuration, and returned to its surface when they were shut off. Hutchison, to his considerable credit, did not immediately announce a discovery. He spent the next several years attempting to characterize and document the effect systematically. What he found through methodical and extensively filmed experimentation was a family of phenomena, all produced by the overlapping of multiple electromagnetic fields of specific frequencies and intensities. Metal objects levitated. Metal objects, at room temperature, with no heat source applied, became temporarily soft, deformed, bent, jellified, fused. Steel bars twisted and fractured with no mechanical force applied. Materials that normally behaved as conductors began exhibiting insulating properties, and vice versa. And most significantly, for the documentary's central argument, measurable electrical power was generated by the field interactions with no apparent input equal to the measured output. The documentation of the Hutchison effect is extensive. Hundreds of hours of video footage exist, shot across multiple decades under varying conditions. The footage was examined by physicists at McDonnell Douglas, the aerospace company, who sent representatives to Vancouver to observe demonstrations. It was examined by personnel from the United States Army Research Laboratory and the Canadian Department of National Defence, who also sent representatives. Samples of metal that had been anomalously affected by the effect were analysed at multiple independent laboratories, whose reports confirmed that the physical alterations were real, unexplained by any conventional metallurgical process, and consistent with Hutchison's descriptions of the effect. In 1978, 1 year before the documented discovery, Canadian authorities raided Hutchison's laboratory and seized his equipment. In subsequent years, further seizures occurred. Hutchison has continued working across the decades, recreating his apparatus from scratch multiple times. In the original configuration, the specific array of devices that first produced the effect has never been fully reconstructed. The phenomena he documented have never been comprehensively replicated in an institutional setting, in part because of the extraordinary complexity of the electromagnetic environment required, and in part because no institution has committed the resources to attempt it. The footage still exists. It is available. The physics remains unexplained. There are cases in this documentary that require careful handling because the evidence is circumstantial, the claims are large, and the documentation is incomplete. Eugene Malov's story is not one of those cases. It is instead a case where the documentation is substantial, the credentials are impeccable, and the outcome is undeniable. The only part that is uncertain is the why. Malov graduated from MIT with a degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering and went on to complete graduate work at Harvard. He worked as a science journalist at MIT's news office for years, covering physics research with both technical precision and the ability to translate complex results for a general audience. He was, by every account of colleagues who knew him, a rigorous skeptic, not credulous, not ideological, trained to examine claims rather than accept or reject them on the basis of their implications. When the cold fusion announcement came from the University of Utah in 1989, when Stanley Ponce and Martin Fleischmann claimed to have achieved nuclear fusion in a tabletop experiment at room temperature, Malov was in a position to examine the subsequent controversy more closely than almost anyone. He watched the original experimental claims. He watched the debunking campaigns. And as he watched, he became convinced that the debunking was not being conducted with the same scientific rigor as the original experiments. He resigned from MIT. He founded Infinite Energy magazine. He spent the next 15 years doing what almost no one in the mainstream scientific establishment would do, taking the experimental claims seriously, applying the same methodological standards to alternative energy research that mainstream science applied to conventional research, and documenting what he found. The journal became the most credible voice in a field that mainstream institutions refused to engage with, precisely because Malov refused to be credulous on either side. By 2004, after reviewing thousands of papers and experimental reports from researchers around the world, Malov had concluded that the evidence for anomalous energy effects in certain metal hydrogen systems was cumulatively too strong to dismiss. And not definitive, he was too careful a scientist for that word, but too strong to ignore. He announced that he was preparing to release a summary of findings that he described as significant. On May 14, 2004, he drove to a property he owned in Norwich, Connecticut, to deal with a rental matter. He was found dead. He had been beaten to death with a blunt object. He was 56 years old. The Norwich police investigated. The case remains officially open. No charges have ever been filed. The research he had been preparing to release was never found in a form suitable for publication. This documentary does not claim that Eugene Malov was killed for his research. It notes only what is documented and verifiable and leaves the pattern visible for the audience to evaluate. The cases you have heard about in this chapter, Morey, Hutchison, Malov, are the ones that have left enough of a documentary trail to be examined in any detail. They are the ones with the affidavits and the footage and the published accounts. They are the cases that could not be entirely erased. For every case that left a trail, there are cases that did not. And the documentary record, incomplete as it is, contains enough fragments of these quieter stories to suggest that the pattern is considerably wider than the examples given here. A German engineer demonstrated a working magnetic motor at a Munich trade exposition in 1978. The motor was witnessed by other exhibitors and by visiting engineers from several European countries. Within 3 months, the engineer had withdrawn all claims, taken down his exhibition materials, and according to the accounts of people who knew him, moved out of Germany with no forwarding address. No explanation was ever given. The motor has never been described in any subsequent publication. An Australian researcher at a university in Brisbane received a 3-year government grant in the early 1990s to investigate anomalous effects in pulsed magnetic field systems. Midway through the research period, his grant was cancelled without the standard review process. He was not informed of the reason. 3 months before the cancellation, according to a colleague who has since spoken about the matter, 2 men from the Australian Department of Defence visited the university and met with the department head for approximately 45 minutes. No record of this meeting was logged in the department's official visitors register. A Japanese engineer spent 14 years submitting variations of the same cold fusion patent application to the Japanese Patent Office. Each application was rejected. He documented the specific methodological objections raised by each rejection and redesigned his experiments to address them. The objections raised in subsequent rejections were different, not building on the previous ones, but replacing them, suggesting not a consistent technical concern, but a consistent institutional decision dressed in sequential technical language. He eventually stopped submitting. He now works for a petrochemical company. An American graduate student at a university in the Pacific Northwest completed a doctoral thesis on anomalous electromagnetic energy extraction. that was reviewed, accepted, and approved by his doctoral committee in 1997. The thesis was submitted for publication in the university's library. It never appeared. The student left academia without taking up any of the academic positions he had been offered. He has not published since. None of these cases is individually conclusive. Individually, each has a plausible conventional explanation: a grant cancelled by budget constraints, a student who changed his mind, an engineer who retired. But the pattern they form across continents, across decades, across different technologies and different institutional contexts is not a pattern that conventional explanations fully account for. The ones we know about are not all of them, and the ones we do not know about may be in aggregate and where the most significant work has happened and been lost. Take a moment to sit with a single number. The global energy industry, oil, gas, coal, conventional electricity generation, and distribution generates in the region of $10 trillion in economic activity every year. 10 followed by 12 zeros. A number so large that it resists ordinary comprehension. A number that represents approximately 10% of the entire global economy. A fraction of all human economic activity that flows annually from the pockets of every person on Earth into the hands of the companies, states, and investors who control the infrastructure of energy production and distribution. Now consider what would happen to that $10 trillion if energy were free, not cheaper, free, not cleaner, or more efficiently distributed, but simply available. The way the air is available, the way sunlight is available, the way the electromagnetic field of the Earth has always been available to anyone with the right structure to access it. The answer is not complicated. That $10 trillion would cease to exist as a commercial category. The entire apparatus of energy extraction, processing, transmission, and sale would become unnecessary. Not disrupted in the way that streaming disrupted DVD rental, or the way smartphones disrupted cameras. Eliminated. The economic category itself, energy as a product, would dissolve. Follow the implications of that dissolution. The petrostates, the nations whose entire political economy, whose social stability, whose capacity to project power internationally, is built on the revenue from hydrocarbon resources, would face an existential economic transformation with no parallel in modern history, as the oil majors, the companies whose market capitalizations are among the largest in the world, would see their core assets become worthless overnight. The banks that lend to these companies, the pension funds that hold their shares, the sovereign wealth funds built from their revenues, the governments that tax their profits, the cascade of consequences runs through every corner of the global financial system. This is the actual scale of the threat that free energy technology represents, not to a handful of greedy individuals, not to a shadowy elite, to the structural architecture of the global economy as it has been organized for the past 150 years. From this scale of threat, a conclusion follows that is both obvious and important. You do not need a conspiracy to produce suppression of this magnitude. You do not need secret meetings or coordinated plans or explicit agreements between powerful actors. You need only an economic system whose survival instinct is proportional to what it stands to lose. And the global energy economy stands to lose everything. Its response to a threat of that magnitude is not a plot. It is a reflex. There is a concept in academic, economics, and political science called regulatory capture. It was described formally by the economist George Stigler in 1971 and has been the subject of thousands of academic papers since. It is not a controversial idea. It is not fringe thinking. It is a standard analytical framework taught in economics and public policy programs at universities around the world, including at the institutions that produce the people who work in government regulatory agencies. Regulatory capture is the process by which a regulatory agency, created to act in the public interest, gradually comes to act in the interest of the industry it was designed to regulate. It happens through a variety of mechanisms, none of which require corruption in the criminal sense. The revolving door between industry and regulator, in which agency staff move to industry positions after their regulatory service and vice versa, creates a social network of shared interest and mutual obligation. The dependence of regulators on industry expertise for technical knowledge creates an information asymmetry that systematically advantages the regulated. The career structures of regulatory agencies create institutional incentives to maintain stable relationships with the industries they oversee rather than disrupt them over time without any single actor making any single corrupt decision. The regulatory agency becomes an instrument for protecting the interests of the industry rather than constraining them. In the energy sector, this dynamic is not speculative. The revolving door between energy companies and the Department of Energy, such the Environmental Protection Agency and the Patent and Trademark Office, is documented in congressional records and investigative journalism going back decades. The professional incentives of patent examiners, government energy researchers, and regulatory officials are structurally aligned with the stability of the existing energy industry. An examiner who approves a revolutionary energy patent does not thereby advance their career. An examiner who finds sufficient methodological grounds to return the application for revision does not impede anyone with institutional power. Apply this framework to the pattern we have been examining throughout this documentary, and a coherent mechanism emerges, one that requires no conspiracy and no coordination, only the ordinary operation of institutional incentives. Patents classified under the Invention Secrecy Act are not reviewed by disinterested scientists. They are reviewed by defense agencies with deep structural ties to the energy industry. Academic grants for alternative energy research are not awarded by disinterested panels. They are awarded by bodies whose funding comes partly from the industries whose technologies the research might supplant. In regulatory approval processes for novel energy technologies are not conducted by disinterested examiners. They are conducted by agencies that have spent decades building stable relationships with the incumbent energy sector. The machine suppresses without knowing it is suppressing. That is the most efficient kind of suppression because it leaves no fingerprints and requires no maintenance. By now, you may have noticed something in your own response to this documentary, a flicker, perhaps, at several points a faint internal signal that sounds something like, "This sounds too much like a conspiracy theory," or "These claims are extraordinary, and I am not sure I should be taking them seriously," or simply a vague sense of social discomfort, the feeling of being in territory that is not quite respectable. That feeling is real, and it is worth examining because it is doing work that is not entirely your own. The most effective tool in the suppression of free energy research is not legal, it is not physical, it is not institutional in the formal sense, it is cultural. Specifically, it is the production of social embarrassment around the subject, the manufacturing of a categorical association between free energy research and the broad territory of crackpot science, flat earthism, alien abduction, and pseudo-scientific delusion. When even asking the question marks you as credulous, and when mentioning Tesla's free energy claims in a professional context requires a preemptive disclaimer about not being a conspiracy theorist, when the phrase itself triggers a specific kind of intellectual condescension in otherwise open-minded people, the suppression has become self-sustaining. No further enforcement is necessary. The culture enforces itself. This association did not arise naturally, it was constructed. The conflation of legitimate electromagnetic energy research with perpetual motion machine fraud began in earnest following the cold fusion debacle of 1989, when the premature and poorly controlled announcement by Ponce and Fleischmann gave mainstream science an opportunity to condemn an entire field of inquiry by association with a single high-profile failure. The media amplified the condemnation because scientific takedowns make better copy than scientific anomalies. And the resulting cultural narrative that free energy research is the province of cranks and charlatans has persisted because it serves the interests of those for whom it is convenient for the subject to be unspeakable. There is an important distinction here between skepticism and dismissal. Skepticism is epistemically healthy. It asks for evidence and reserves judgment in its absence. Dismissal is epistemically lazy. It decides the answer before examining the evidence and then looks for reasons not to engage. The culture of dismissal that surrounds free energy research serves the interests of the existing energy economy, and that service is not coincidental. You probably felt a flicker of that dismissal at some point in this documentary. Notice that feeling. Not to overcome it, skepticism is warranted, but to ask yourself, where did it come from? And when did you decide that this subject was the kind that serious people did not take seriously? And who benefited from that decision? There is a quality to officially confirmed information that no amount of testimony or analysis can replicate. A solidity, a weight, a capacity to close down certain lines of denial that felt, before the confirmation, entirely reasonable. This documentary has spent considerable time with testimony, with historical record, with documented patterns of anomalous outcomes. Now it is time for the official record. The High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, known as HAARP, is a research facility in Alaska operated by the United States military that uses high-powered radio transmitters to direct focused electromagnetic energy into the ionosphere. Its stated purposes include ionospheric research, communication experiments, and the study of the electromagnetic properties of the upper atmosphere. Its documentation, technical specifications, operational parameters, research objectives has been largely declassified and is publicly available. Read that documentation with the preceding chapters of this documentary in mind, and what you are reading is a large-scale, well-funded, officially acknowledged program of research into the precise properties of the Earth ionosphere electromagnetic cavity that Tesla described in his 1899 Colorado Springs notebooks. The physics HARP uses, in the frequencies HARP operates at, the phenomena HARP studies, they are in every essential physical respect the same as what Tesla was investigating with Wardenclyffe. The government spent 100 years saying that Tesla's ideas were the province of cranks. It built HARP in the meantime. In 2001, the British journalist Nick Cook published a book called The Hunt for 0 Point, documenting his access to declassified defense research files from the Cold War period. What those files showed, and what Cook documented with the precision of a trained investigative journalist, was that multiple governments, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, ran active research programs in the 1950s and 1960s on anti-gravity propulsion and 0 point energy extraction. These programs were funded, staffed, and active. Their results were classified. The outputs remain, in most cases, unknown. The Tesla documents that were seized in 1943 were partially released in the 1980s. The portion released confirms what was already known from Tesla's published work. The portions that remain classified, which Tesla's published work does not cover, are the experimental results from the Wardenclyffe operational period and from the Colorado Springs work that went beyond what Tesla chose to publish. These remain unavailable. What the declassified files tell us is not the answer. They tell us something more important, that the question has been taken seriously by people with the resources and the authority to pursue it in classified contexts. The argument is no longer whether these technologies were researched. The argument is what that research found, and the answer to that question is still deliberately and specifically not available to you. The cold fusion story is one of the strangest in the history of science, not because of the original claims, which were poorly supported, but because of what happened in the 3 decades after those claims were dismissed. Because what happened was not silence, and it was not the orderly resolution of a failed experimental program. What happened was that thousands of researchers, working independently in dozens of countries, kept finding the same anomalous results that Ponce and Fleischmann had originally described, and kept publishing papers about them, and kept having those papers reviewed and published, and kept getting the same response from the mainstream. Polite acknowledgement, followed by continued institutional neglect. To be precise about the numbers, since the 1989 debunking, more than 3,000 peer-reviewed papers have been published in scientific journals describing what is now called low-energy nuclear reactions, or LENR, anomalous heat production in metal hydrogen systems at or near room temperature. And these papers do not all agree on the mechanism. They do not all use the same materials or the same experimental configuration. But they are, as a body of literature, characterized by a consistent and specific experimental result, measured heat output that substantially exceeds the electrical input, in conditions that conventional chemistry and conventional nuclear physics cannot explain. The United States Navy's Space and Naval Warfare Systems Command, SPAWA, published positive results from LENR experiments conducted at their own laboratory. These were official naval research papers, peer-reviewed, published in mainstream journals, describing anomalous energy effects in palladium-deuterium systems. NASA, which is not known for credulous engagement with alternative science, has an active LENR research program and has published multiple documents describing the phenomenon as real and warranting serious investigation. The Italian physicist Andrea Rossi developed a device he called the energy catalyzer, or ECAT, in the 2000s. Two independent groups of European scientists, academic physicists with no connection to Rossi, conducted formal third-party tests of the device and published their results. Both groups reported energy output between 3 and 6 times the electrical input over extended test periods. The devices used standard laboratory measurement instruments and standard protocols. The tests were conducted under conditions that excluded, so far as the testers could determine, conventional energy storage or hidden power sources. The mainstream science press largely ignored these results. The funding available for LENR research remains a fraction of the funding devoted to hot fusion programs that have been promising commercial power in 10 years for the past 60 years. Something is happening in metal hydrogen systems. 3,000 papers say so. The Navy says so. NASA says so. The question of what exactly and whether it can be scaled remains open. The question of why it is not receiving proportionate mainstream attention is, by this point in this documentary, considerably less mysterious. There is a peculiar thing happening at the intersection of extreme private wealth and advanced energy research in the contemporary technological landscape, and it is not something that receives proportionate coverage in the mainstream technology press. In November 2014, Lockheed Martin's Advanced Development Programs Division, the Skunk Works, a facility whose history includes the development of the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the F-117 stealth fighter, publicly announced that it was developing a compact fusion reactor small enough to fit on the back of a truck. The announcement was made by the head of the project, a credentialed aerospace engineer named Tom McGuire, who stated that a working prototype was expected within 5 years and a commercially deployable unit within 10. The physics described in the announcement was not speculative fringe science. It was a novel approach to plasma confinement, using specific magnetic field geometries that the Skunk Works team had been working on for years. It has now been more than 10 years since that announcement. The commercially deployable unit has not materialized. The prototype has not been publicly demonstrated. Lockheed has said very little about the project's status since 2014. Whatever is happening in that facility is happening without public accountability. Peter Thiel, the venture capitalist who co-founded PayPal and was among the first outside investors in Facebook, has provided funding to multiple alternative energy research programs, including Helion Energy's fusion program, which completed a significant fundraising round in 2021 on the strength of results that the company's published materials describe in carefully limited but not dismissive terms. Thiel's investment logic, as he has described it in various forums, is based on a straightforward observation. The conventional energy research pipeline, dominated by institutional funders with structural ties to the incumbent energy economy, systematically underinvests in revolutionary approaches. Private capital, free from those structural constraints, can go where institutions will not. Brillouin Energy Corporation, based in California, has a research partnership with the Stanford Research Institute, not a fringe institution. Their nickel hydrogen LENR reactor has been tested by independent engineers, hired by investors, and has produced consistent positive results in those tests. The company is not publicly listed. Its funding is private. Its results, while not widely covered, are documented. The paradox of Silicon Valley's involvement in alternative energy is worth noting. The private investors funding this research are themselves major stakeholders in the global economy, an economy that has historically suppressed the technologies they are now funding. Whether this represents a genuine disruption of the suppression dynamic or simply its most recent adaptation is a question that the next decade will begin to answer. There is a version of the free energy suppression story that ends in the 20th century with Tesla's papers in a government archive, More's device dismantled, Malovey's research lost, and the patent intact and effective. That version is now outdated, and the reason it is outdated is something that the architects of the 20th century suppression system could not have anticipated: the Internet. The mechanism of suppression that worked for 100 years operated on a specific architectural assumption that significant experimental results were produced in single locations by single researchers, are documented in physical form and vulnerable to seizure, destruction, or classification at the source. You went to the laboratory, took the device or the notebooks, and the knowledge was gone. Simple, effective, largely invisible. This architecture does not describe the contemporary research environment. A researcher working on pulsed electromagnetic energy today is likely to be filming their experiments on a standard digital camera, i.e. uploading footage to multiple video platforms before the day is over, sharing their experimental protocols in open source technical forums where they are immediately replicated and discussed by engineers in dozens of countries, and maintaining their data in cloud storage, backed up in jurisdictions across multiple continents. The laboratory is everywhere. The knowledge belongs to everyone who has downloaded it. You cannot raid that laboratory with any number of agents because it has no doors. The global open source energy research community is large, serious, and growing. It includes Paul Babcock, whose work on pulsed electromagnetic systems has been presented at conferences and documented in reports that circulate freely. It includes Eric Dollard, whose theoretical and experimental work on radiant energy, the same energy category that Tesla and Moray were investigating, has been presented in exhaustive detail in publicly available lectures. It includes hundreds of independent experimenters running variations of the Colorado Springs experiment using modern equipment, documenting their results and posting them in real time, where any government agent who wanted to suppress them would need to simultaneously contact every video platform in every country and every forum server on the internet. This is not naive optimism. The suppression mechanisms of the regulatory apparatus and the academic consensus and the cultural dismissal are still operating. They are still effective at keeping alternative energy research out of mainstream funding streams and mainstream publications. But they are no longer effective at preventing the research from being done, documented, and shared. The knowledge is out in a way that it was not out in 1943 or 1974 or 1998. For the first time in the 100-year history of this story, and the suppression is fighting a distributed target, and a distributed target is the hardest kind to eliminate. In June 2021, the United States government published an official report on unidentified aerial phenomena, the first formal governmental acknowledgement in decades that military personnel had been observing aerial objects exhibiting flight characteristics that could not be explained by any known aircraft technology. The objects described in the report and in the congressional testimony that accompanied and followed it were not presented as mysterious curiosities. They were presented as genuine defense concerns, observed consistently, recorded on multiple independent sensor systems, and operating in restricted military airspace with apparent impunity. The flight characteristics described by military pilots under oath and confirmed by radar operators, infrared sensors, and electro-optical tracking systems include the following: instantaneous acceleration from stationary to hypersonic velocities without any observable propulsion signature, sharp right-angle turns at speeds at which any known airframe would disintegrate, sustained flight at altitudes from sea level to above 100,000 feet in a single continuous trajectory, operation for extended periods without any observable fuel intake or exhaust. This documentary is not making claims about the origin of these objects. Their origin is not the point. The point is the energy technology implied by their observed behavior. Instantaneous acceleration to hypersonic velocity requires an energy output that, for any mass-bearing object, is calculable. The amount of energy required is not ambiguous. It is a physics calculation. The result of that calculation is a number that does not correspond to anything in the publicly known energy technology landscape. Not fossil fuels, not nuclear fission, not the most advanced aerospace propulsion systems in any publicly acknowledged arsenal. The observed behavior implies an energy source that converts input to kinetic output with an efficiency that is not achievable using any publicly known physics. In the most credentialed voices in the UAP disclosure conversation, among them former senior intelligence officials, aerospace engineers with decades of classified program experience, and military officers who have testified before Congress are not suggesting alien technology as the explanation. They are pointing to classified human technology, advanced research programs, separated from the conventional defense pipeline decades ago, funded through unacknowledged channels, whose results have never entered the civilian economy. If that assessment is correct, then the documentary's central argument arrives at a conclusion more stark than anything that preceded it. Free energy technology does not need to be demonstrated. It does not need to be proven through open source research or LENR papers or the reconstruction of Tesla's Colorado Springs experiments. If the technology required to produce the observed flight characteristics of UAPs exists, then free energy technology already exists. It is operational. It is being used, just not by us. Set aside the technology for a moment. Set aside the history, the suppression, the pattern of disappeared inventors and classified documents and unsealed chambers filled with concrete. Set those aside and ask a simpler question. What would the world actually look like, in physical terms, if energy were free? Not in the vague, sci-fi sense of the question, in the specific, grounded, human sense. And begin with this. 800 million people alive on Earth right now do not have reliable access to electricity. They cook over open fires that fill their lungs with smoke. They study by the light of candles or nothing. They lose food to spoilage that refrigeration would prevent. They die of diseases that clean water, requiring energy to pump and purify, would stop. This is not poverty in the abstract. This is a physical condition produced by the absence of a specific resource, energy. And the absence of that resource is not a natural condition. It is an economic one. Energy exists. It is abundant. The people without it do not lack access to it, because there is not enough to go around. They lack access to it because the infrastructure of energy distribution is built on the premise of energy as a commodity, and commodities flow to markets, not to need. A world with free, wirelessly accessible energy would begin in the first years with the elimination of energy poverty, not its reduction, its elimination. The infrastructure problem, the last mile challenge of getting power to remote communities without grid infrastructure, dissolves when the grid itself is the electromagnetic field of the Earth. A receiver on a mud brick wall in a village in the Sahel accesses the same energy as a data center in Silicon Valley. From this single change, the cascade of consequences is vast. Agriculture becomes capable of supporting water, desalination, and irrigation at scales that would transform arid land into productive land across entire continents. The economics of armed conflict, which are rooted substantially in competition over energy-producing territories, lose their foundation. The political power of petrostates, which is purchased with oil revenue, evaporates. The carbon combustion that is currently heating the planet becomes economically irrational because the free alternative is available everywhere. This was not a future that failed to arrive. It is a future that was cancelled, and the weight of that cancellation, felt against the specific physical reality of the 800 million people living without electricity right now, is not abstract. It is a moral account of everything this documentary has been trying to describe. This documentary has spent considerable time in the territory of loss. Lost devices, lost documents. I lost decades of research that should have been building towards something and was instead dispersed or suppressed or simply not funded. It would be dishonest to close that arc without acknowledging the people who are, right now, working to recover what was lost and to push beyond it. Mehran Tavakoli Keshe is an Iranian-Belgian nuclear engineer who developed, over 2 decades of private research, a set of technologies based on plasma physics that he calls the plasma reactor system. His claims are large and, depending on your framework, either extraordinary or consistent with the physics of the preceding chapters: anomalous energy generation, gravitational field interaction, and medical applications based on plasma field manipulation. In 2015 and 2016, he gave his technology to the governments of 44 nations through a formal treaty process, with each government signing a confidentiality agreement regarding the demonstrations conducted for their technical representatives. The results of those demonstrations have not been publicly released. The confidentiality agreements remain in force. James Griggs is an American engineer whose hydrosonic pump, a device that heats water through hydrodynamic cavitation, produces consistent and measurable excess heat output relative to its electrical input. Multiple independent engineering studies have confirmed this excess. The mechanism remains disputed. Some researchers attribute it to a form of low-level nuclear reaction, others to conventional hydrodynamic effects not fully accounted for in the models. What is not disputed is the measured result. The late Floyd Sweet, working in California in the 1980s and early 1990s, developed a device he called the vacuum triode amplifier, which reportedly produced kilowatts of electrical output from milliwatts of input by interacting with the ambient electromagnetic field of the Earth. His results were witnessed and documented by multiple credentialed engineers, including the physicist Tom Bearden, whose theoretical framework for the device's operation draws on the same zero-point energy physics described in Chapter 6. Sweet died in 1995. The device has not been successfully replicated, and beyond these named figures, in laboratories and garages and university workshops in 17 countries, engineers are right now running variations of Tesla's Colorado Springs experiment, using modern signal generators, modern measurement equipment, and modern data logging. Some are finding nothing. Some are finding anomalies that they do not yet know how to interpret. Some are posting everything online: methodology, data, footage, results in real time, where it cannot be seized because it already belongs to everyone. And the road is being walked. The destination is not yet visible. But the footprints are accumulating, and they point in a direction that the first 100 years of this story worked very hard to ensure they would not point. For the first time in this documentary, the narration is going to speak to you directly, not as the third-person voice of the story, but as the voice of someone who has spent a significant amount of time examining this material and wants to be honest with you about what that examination does and does not support. This documentary has not proven that free energy technology definitively works at commercial scale. It has not proven that specific acts of suppression were deliberate rather than incidental. It has not proven that the seized Tesla documents contain a complete blueprint for a working world system, or that any of the inventors profiled were killed for their work, or that the UAP phenomenon is powered by technology derived from suppressed energy research. What it has done, through the documented historical record, through the physics of the Earth ionosphere cavity, through the legal framework of the Invention Secrecy Act, through the economic analysis of who benefits from energy remaining a commodity, is establish carefully and with specific reference to verifiable sources that the conditions for suppression exist, that the incentives for suppression are among the largest that the economic history of the world has ever produced, and that the pattern of outcomes across independent cases, separated by decades and continents, is consistent with the hypothesis that suppression has been a systematic feature of the free energy research landscape since before 1917. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. It is enough to make dismissal of the subject epistemically dishonest in a way that it was not before this documentary began. What the documentary is asking of you is not belief. Belief is not the right response to incomplete evidence. What it is asking is a specific quality of attention, the refusal to dismiss, the application of the same critical standard to the mainstream narrative and to the suppressed one, the willingness to hold the question open rather than closing it with either credulity or contempt. And one more thing, the question that this documentary has been asking in various forms since its first minute: why is the world arranged the way it is, and who benefits from it staying that way, is not a question that belongs only to the history of energy technology. It is the most politically consequential question that any person in any society can ask. It is the question that every powerful institution is structurally motivated to prevent from being asked. And the fact that you are asking it, even partially, even tentatively, in the small hours of the morning, listening to the story of a man who died alone in a hotel room with his life's work in a folder that the government took before the body was cold, that matters. We are not asking you to believe everything you heard today. We are asking you to ask why you were never taught any of it. You drive out to Shoreham, Long Island, one evening when the light is low and the salt air from the sound is moving through the grass, and stand on the flat expanse of land where Wardenclyffe Tower once stood. There is a small museum now. There are informational plaques. There is a carefully tended area where visitors can stand and look at the place where, in 1901, a man began building a structure that he believed would change the relationship between humanity and the energy that surrounds it. Beneath your feet, if the historical record is accurate, are the concrete-filled chambers of the resonance system, sealed in 1917, 108 years ago, permanent and silent under the grass. Whatever was in those chambers, whatever relationship with the Earth's electromagnetic system Tesla had managed to establish and was beginning to develop, is entombed there. The chamber is not a ruin, it is too complete for that word. It is a burial, and yet the thing that was buried cannot be reached by concrete. The physics of the Earth ionosphere cavity cannot be filled in. The Schumann resonance is not in any archive. It is outside now, in the air above you and in the ground beneath you, and in the standing wave that propagates around the planet at 7.83 hertz, and exactly as it was propagating on the night in the summer of 1899, when Tesla stood in a field in Colorado and watched 200 bulbs burn in the darkness without a single wire connecting them to anything. The earth is still vibrating. It has not stopped. It will not stop. The energy that Tesla was trying to access does not require his permission or his presence. It simply is, the way gravity is, the way light is, the way the quantum vacuum is. Even at absolute zero, I still alive, with fluctuations that carry energy no law of physics requires to be inaccessible. What the century of suppression that this documentary has traced amounts to, at its most fundamental level, is a century of delay. Not of impossibility, delay. The physics was not changed by the demolition of Wardenclyffe. The Earth's resonant frequency was not altered by the classification of Tesla's papers. The zero-point field did not become less real because the Invention Secrecy Act prevented its investigation. The delay was bought at an enormous cost, the cost measured in the energy poverty of 800 million people, in the carbon in the atmosphere, in the wars fought over resources that would have had no value in a world of free energy. But it was a delay, not a conclusion. The world's energy economy is not a natural condition. It is an engineered one, built on specific decisions made by specific people in specific financial interests at specific points in the past. It can be engineered differently. The laws of physics do not prohibit it. Only the laws of economics do. And economic laws, unlike physical ones, change when enough people stop believing in them. He knew that night on the mountain. The knowing has never gone away. It has only been waiting. And somewhere tonight, in a laboratory on 4 continents,